on land, at sea, in the air, and even in outer space. This is the All Our Yesterdays podcast, brought to you by Persistence of Vision Publishing. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the All Our Yesterdays podcast.
Every single one of our yesterdays?
Every single effing one, and then some. We got William Gold in the house.
Hello.
Hello, William Gold. How do you do? We got my man, Lance Fever.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. My name is LB Deyo, and we're the crazy cats who bring you this show. So let's get into it. We talked recently about ancient Egypt, and now we're going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about two civilizations. We haven't done that before, have we, boys?
Two of them.
Yeah, two civilizations that have a lot in common, although they, of course, have some important differences as well. The two civilizations are the Indus Valley Civilization in what is now India and Pakistan, and the Minoan Civilization on the island of Crete, which is in the southern part of Greece. What have these civilizations in common?
Time?
Time is one. Tell us, Lance Fever, where do you think they fall on the timeline?
Well, I think they fall, I guess, close to what we were talking about last time, right? Egypt was around this same time period as well. But as you pointed out, Egypt is still around, while these two are not. But like 3000 BC?
3000, 3300, up until about 1450 or 1330, depending on which one we're talking about. In other words, they're very close in the time spans that they both existed in, and they are, as you said, close to the ancient Egyptian time frame that we discussed last time. Also, the same time frame as a lot of other action in that part of the world. You know, we talked about Mesopotamia several episodes ago with civilizations like the Sumer and Akkad and so forth, Babylon. These are all contemporaneous. So there's a lot going on. One thing that's interesting about Minoa is it is our first European civilization.
Ah.
Yeah, so that's kind of hip and cool. It's basically an ancient Greek civilization, although it is so different from the other ancient Greek civilizations that are going to come later that we know a lot less about it. Okay? And one of the reasons for that is they didn't speak Greek.
What did they speak?
They spoke Minoan.
Really? They had their
I
own?
think so, yeah.
Doing their own thing.
But it's tough to say because I'm going to tell you another thing that these two civilizations have in common. They're both very important historical civilizations that have had a great deal of influence in their own way, at least at the time, but neither of them has a writing system that we have ever been able to decipher. So we're kind of back in the same situation we were in that prehistory episode.
Ah.
Right? Because what did we say constitutes prehistory?
You got to write it down.
Well, history is what you write down. Yeah. So if you don't write it down, it ain't history. It's prehistory. So we don't actually have a history of the Indus Valley Civilization in India or the Minoan Civilization in Greece and Crete. We are left with an archaeological record only. And so that's frustrating, but it's also kind of romantic and enticing because what we see is that these were remarkable civilizations.
What makes them remarkable, LB?
Well, I'll give you a hint. One thing, well, I want to mention one other distinction, which is that while the Minoans were a fairly ambitious and influential in their own way civilization, and that they engaged in a lot of sea trade, for example, they were not a big major civilization the way that Indus Valley was. Indus Valley is fascinating because it was one of the larger civilizations in the world at that time. It had about 3 million people, 3, 4, something like that, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to remember that the entire population of the world was about 50 million at this time. So we're talking about a very substantial number of people living in this civilization, that they have a number of remarkable technological achievements, and they have a number of remarkable cultural achievements, and yet we know little about them. And in fact, unlike them, well, a little different from the Minoans is the fact that the Indus Valley Civilization was lost to history. And I think that is a big distinction, actually. Minoan civilization has been known of for a long time, but the Indus Valley Civilization was forgotten. Even, even within the ancient period, it died out and was replaced by other Indian civilizations that apparently didn't know about the Indus Valley civilization, or at least we don't have any of their writings about it. So, as far as anyone knew until the 20th century, this entire large civilization had never existed. It was discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century, just as Uruk was in Sumer and so forth. And just like with Sumer, no one knew that this civilization had been there.
So where exactly is this? So when I look at the Indus Valley, it's actually a pretty big area, isn't it? I mean,
It's quite big, yeah.
are we talking about the entire valley area, or was this concentrated in any particular spot?
Well, it's an area along the Indus River,
Okay.
which will remind us that, as we've discussed in previous episodes, all of these civilizations so far have been river civilizations.
Right.
It had an area of approximately 500,000 square miles. It was in present day Pakistan and northwest India. So there were key cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and as we see elsewhere, we have the civilization supported by seasonal flooding of the Indus River.
Yeah.
You know, again, we see civilization relying upon the tendency of great rivers to flood and enrich the soil around in their areas. Now, contrast that with the Minoan civilization is really the first sea civilization that we're going to be discussing on this show. The location is the island of Crete, so that explains why it's a sea civilization. Crete is a not so huge island. It's roughly 3,000 square miles, and they had a population of about 100,000 people in the Minoan civilization. They had big cities like Knossos and Phaistos. They thrived on trade with the maritime economy due to the island location in the Mediterranean Sea. So they are trading with other Mediterranean civilizations, and that is how they are surviving and thriving. So that's a contrast between them. The riverine civilization of Indus Valley versus the Minoan seafaring civilization. There are also their own different environmental challenges. The flooding of the Indus made the soil fertile, but flooding is also a peril to the people who live there, right? I mean, as we see in the fact that the flood story from the book of Genesis is actually a much older story than the Bible and goes back all the way to the Sumerians, we see that, in fact, most early civilizations had flood myths, regardless of where they were in the world. And Indus Valley civilization probably did too, though we don't know any of their mythology. Whereas on Crete, the Minoan civilization had to contend with earthquakes and possible volcanic activity. So I don't know if that's in any way related to the fact that the later Greek god of Poseidon was both the god of the sea and the god of earthquakes.
Ha! I did not know that.
Oh yes, he was the earth shaker. So is that a Minoan thing? I doubt it, but it sure sounds good, doesn't it? Now, what these civilizations have in common with all this, or most of the civilizations we've discussed, is that they're essentially urban civilizations. They are supported by a ton of farming, but their great legacy in terms of archaeological record is their cities. And the Indus Valley Civilization in particular is remarkable for its advanced city planning. They had a grid-like streets, the likes of which we see in modern Manhattan. They had sophisticated drainage systems. They had a uniformity in building construction that suggests a kind of centralized authority, perhaps, might have
Hmm.
imposed it. And in cities like Mohenjo-Daro, they had this marvelous structure called the Great Bath, which is its purpose is not known, right?
To get clean,
To get clean, but it was a large public bath. It wasn't
to get clean together.
wasn't a private bath. And there's a cliche or an old saw in archaeological circles that if we don't know what something is, we say that it's sacred.
Ah,
We say that it's somehow associated with a temple. And apparently, the Great Bath has often been assumed to be a sacred bath that where people wash themselves, did an ablution, the likes of which they today do in the Ganges River in India.
yeah. So this
But we
is
don't know.
okay. So this is the Indus Valley
Mm-hmm.
Civilization. Yeah. So what's interesting to me, right? I mean, I guess I just don't know that much about archaeological methods, but to have a civilization that has these things that you're talking about, like the gridded streets, the baths, the things like that, and that it would elude us finding any trace of it until modern times. Do you know what kind of development in technology would surface that we would then be able to find these things?
That's an excellent question. What technological development occurred in the 19th and 20th centuries that allowed these civilizations that have been buried for millennia to suddenly be discovered? Honestly, I don't know, but I think that it has something to do with imperialism. I think that a lot of these civilizations were discovered by British imperialists
Hmm.
who were colonizing these lands.
Hmm.
They had a combination of a profound interest in what to them was an exotic part of the world and an interest in learning about it and its history with the fairly sophisticated post industrial revolution, post enlightenment educated base for some of these people who went over from Britain that made them want to explore and learn. So you'll hear about archaeologists. Often these aren't even professional archaeologists. In fact, archaeology as a profession was only born during this time period. And it often was just some rich British lord or something, or there was a German guy named Schliemann who discovered Troy, and he was just a rich guy. He didn't have any training in archaeology. And in fact, they went in and they ruined the sites.
Yeah.
The the archaeologists of today have very mixed feelings about these guys because yes, they were the sort of founders and forefathers of their field, but they also ruined these very, very important sites by just sort of bulldozing through them, so to speak.
All right, I've got a really stupid question.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. You said buried, that these things were buried.
Yes.
Why are they buried? What happens? Now I can understand something like if there's like a volcanic eruption and these things get buried under ash or something, but that's typically what you hear about when like hear about the discovery of a civilization that is buried. Why
Yes.
are these?
Well, first of
Where's all this earth coming from to bury these ancient cities?
That's a great question, and it does seem odd, right? Because we imagine New York City 2,000 years ago, the tower is rising in the sky. Why would it become buried?
Right.
We remember a couple things. First of all, these buildings are not the Empire State Building. Most of them are 1 or 2 stories. They're made of mud, which means most of them dissolve, right? They just simply melt. And so the few buildings that remain, we have to then ask, where are these buildings? And again, we say, wait a minute, this is in a river valley
Hmm.
where the river floods.
Yeah.
Okay. And when it does, this water is not clear blue water necessarily, it is muddy water. over the thousands of years, yes, there's erosion, there is the distribution of mud by the waters, and any number of other things that result in these sites becoming buried in the ground. So, yeah, so the people who discovered the Indus Valley Civilization were blown away, right? They're like, first of all, look at the history books. It's not there.
Hmm.
There is no history that mentions this civilization. And yet, look at these drainage systems that they have. Look how the they have sewers and toilets. They have these beautiful baths. And so some interesting and real things are learned about them. And then at the same time, however, we fall into some of the traps that archaeology can produce, which is when you have very little evidence, you want to put a story there anyway.
Yeah.
And so, what happened in the Indus Valley civilization in particular, but I think even to a lesser extent with the Minoans, is that based on some very small shreds of evidence, large assumptions have been made. One of them was that an archaeologist who was in the Indus Valleys, I think in the 20s, studying these ruins, found some bows and some arrows
Hmm.
and other weapons. Discovered that the weapons, the points of the arrows, the swords, the metal of the swords, etc., was quite flimsy, and guessed that it wouldn't have been useful as real weapons, that it would only be useful as a kind of a ceremonial thing, almost like a decoration. And from this, extrapolated
Hmm.
to the entire civilization that that must be the nature of the civilization, that it was a peaceful civilization that only had weapons around decoratively. You know, an interesting idea, right? A hypothesis, sure. But when there's no other evidence one way or the other, and this archaeologist has a pretty big name, and we don't have a heck of a lot else to go on, it starts to get cemented. And so even today, you can go and read books about the Indus Valley Civilization that will make these claims that it was very peaceful.
Hmm.
Another example of that is the book that we discovered in our prehistory episode, The Dawn of Everything, which I think really does do this a lot. They will take a civilization about which we know very little. They will take a civilization from which we have maybe a small rooms full of artifacts, and they'll say, "Oh, well, this appears to have been a non-hierarchical civilization with a flat structure where they didn't have kings." And you're looking at the same thing. You're like, "What? Where did you get that?" And they'll
Yeah.
say, "Well, look, there's no evidence of a king." And you say, "Well, there's no evidence of anything else either, hardly, right?
Yeah.
There's evidence that people lived here, but yeah, the fact that the Indus Valley civilization doesn't have any big, tall buildings and just has these sort of uniform looking buildings has been examined, and the assumption has been made based on it that there were no big buildings because there were no kings, or at least if there were kings, they were pretty modest and had a largely ceremonial role or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, I got to say, I think that, as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And to me, the claim that a large civilization with several million people over an area of 500,000 square miles, the claim that this civilization would have been able to function at that time without any royalty is an extraordinary claim.
Or without any good weapons.
Right. Or without any weapons. Yeah.
With no good arrows.
Toy weapons. Right. It's an extraordinary claim, and these this is my opinion, these historians and archaeologists who are making these claims are making them from a lack of evidence.
They're idiots.
Well, yeah, not to put too fine a point on it, but they're
But
idiots.
listen, but that was exactly the feeling I was starting to get. Not that they're idiots, but that that how can we know these things? That if something eludes us for that long, and we find, how is it that we find these things and that we realize that there is a particular civilization? Like, okay, so I'm just thinking it through, right? That
Mhm.
you find somehow you're finding buried architecture
Hmm.
that no one before you has ever found for
Hmm.
thousands of years.
Right.
In that architecture, you're finding what, like probably pots and pans, dishes, maybe pottery, little bits of artwork, again, that no one has ever found before. That seems so odd to me. But then you
Well,
can piece these things together and then decide, I guess maybe through carbon dating or different things like that, where it's like, okay, these lived like alongside other civilizations, everything, and then start to piece together the story. But wow, it's just that's a lot to try to piece together
it
and
is a
figure
lot.
out.
And unlike a place like Sumer or Egypt, where we were able to decipher their texts,
Right.
we have nothing
But
from these
toy arrows.
civilizations. We have toy
You have
arrows, we have
Nerf darts.
uniform buildings. But I think we should backtrack a little bit. I think I may have painted a false picture when I said that the buildings were buried. I mean, they weren't all buried.
Uh-huh.
There were a few buildings here and there, very old, and they kind of looked like almost like mounds in the ground.
Okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they're not very prominent or obviously ancient structures. And then you have to remember these are remote parts of the world. In India, not many people lived in the Indus Valley area at the time that this civilization was discovered. It was like wandering nomads and things like that, small villages. So these people, it's possible that these villagers knew about these ruins,
Oh, gotcha.
but they
Yeah.
weren't in a position in terms of their educational attainment, their connection to the wider world, to say, hey, we've discovered an ancient
Yeah.
civilization. They just weren't.
That's something that I find interesting is the when a civilization declines, and nobody repopulates the area.
Yes.
I wonder why. I mean, these rivers are still flowing.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder what the population around there is now. But we know from recent history, remember the Afghanistan war, for example. We know that when our soldiers were in Afghanistan and then sometimes having to cross into Pakistan, they were in wild areas,
Hmm.
tribal areas they were called, where there were no cities, there weren't even many towns, and where consequently people like Al Qaeda and the Taliban were able to blend in and disappear.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're still not talking about parts of the world where it's not like you go to Times Square and discover an ancient civilization sitting there in the middle of town. It's
Sure.
like you're in a real backwater of the world, a really remote place.
Yeah.
And then they discover this thing. So, but let's talk a little bit about Manoa because Manoa is also interesting for its culture. Even though we don't have their writing, we have their writing, but we can't read it. We know a fair amount about their mythology from later Greek civilizations.
So they have writing. They do have writing.
Absolutely,
How can we not
the
crack that code?
Indus Valley script and a script called Linear B. This is the real reason why I chose these two to discuss on this podcast.
Well, no, you
They have
buried the lead here.
this important thing in common. They both had writing, and we can't decipher it.
What Chat GPT
Chat GPT
can't tell us what that says.
Well, it's funny you should say Chat GPT because I said the same thing. Why can't Chat GPT figure it out? Why can't these incredibly sophisticated AIs figure it out? After all, as I told William Gold, it stands to reason they'd be very good at this because what were computers invented for in the first place? When were computers invented? By whom? Alan Turing, Bletchley Park, World War II. They were built originally to try to decipher German codes. That was their purpose. That's what they were invented for. And so you would think, hey, if you could do that in World War II in the 1940s, can't you do it now for us? Come on.
They just want to sit around and draw as well. Well, that AI just wants to make pictures.
Right. So I asked ChatGPT, I said, why can't you decipher?
Did you really?
Yeah. I said, why can't you decipher this text for
Uh-huh.
us? And ChatGPT, in
I don't
effect,
want
said,
to.
he said, I don't, he said, give me a break. It was trivial to crack the German code. compared to deciphering these scripts. Why?
Yeah, why?
Because the German code was based on German. We know German, right? We don't know German, but we have people who know German, right? We know a guy who
Right.
speaks German. Nobody knows what language these people spoke. We have no reference whatsoever. So if we were to decipher a word, we wouldn't know if we had deciphered it into a language or not. And if we deciphered 3 words, we still wouldn't know any of the rest of the language. And in fact, that is what has happened, because people have been working on this for decades, as you'd imagine. It's hugely important historically to try and fix these, or to solve these riddles. But they have deciphered a few words here and there, a few characters, I should say, because they're not words, they're symbols. But it doesn't give us that thin edge of the wedge.
Yeah, there's no Rosetta Stone of the Indus Valley.
Well, that's what it really comes down to. We think, hey, we cracked ancient Egyptian, we cracked cuneiform a long time ago. So why can't we do these? And the answer is, we were lucky. The
Yeah.
Rosetta Stone was pure luck. You know about the Rosetta Stone, of course. It had Greek writing on it that was easily decipherable. Everybody in the archaeology business knew ancient Greek. But then they would put the same words in hieroglyphics and in cuneiform.
It's almost like too good.
Yeah.
It's too fortuitous. It's too, like, it's just giving it to us.
Well, it's like in basketball when the other team scores and the coach is like, that was too easy. You know, too easy.
Too easy.
Yeah, the Rosetta Stone made it real easy
Yeah.
to crack these other writing systems. But even with the power of computers, we have not been able to do so with these civilizations. So that answers your question, Lance Fever, quite effectively. But I was going to talk a little bit about the Minoan culture. And what do we know about the Minoans from the other ancient Greeks who came a little later? The Mycenaeans, as they're called, who lived in the time of the Trojan War, supposedly. You know, there wasn't really a Trojan War, but you know what I mean. Well, and then through Greek mythology generally, well, there was a king in Greek mythology named Minos, for whom the Minoan civilization is named. That king lived on Crete, which is why they named the civilization after him, even though we don't have any reason to believe he was a real person. And what was the legend about King Minos? Do we remember?
No.
No, exactly.
He had
William Gold remembers.
he had a labyrinth
He had a labyrinth.
That's it.
in which he trapped or kept in captivity a minotaur.
That's
He
correct.
had a minotaur. He had his own minotaur. What does minotaur mean? Minos's bull. So the minotaur is a half man, half bull, kept in a labyrinth, who is fed some people every year as a sacrifice by Minos to keep him from coming out of the labyrinth and killing everybody. Where did he come from, though? The answer is Minos's wife wanted to have sex with a bull. Okay, as some of us do. And she went to Daedalus, the king's inventor slash architect slash all around genius. And Daedalus built her a machine that looked like a bull. She climbs into this. I call it a machine because it's probably solid. It's not like a costume. It's not like made of cloth. It's like a big. Anyway. And this bull that she thinks is so beautiful does go over and couple with her. And
Yeah.
she gives birth to the Minotaur. Meanwhile, Daedalus.
So the minotaur is a sort of a stepchild.
Yes, he's a bastard stepchild of King Minos. King Minos has Daedalus say, he says, I need your help again. I need you to imprison this Minotaur, Daedalus says, no sweat, I'm going to build you a labyrinth. Things go a little wacky, though, later on, and Daedalus winds up being punished and thrown into the labyrinth with his son, Icarus. Daedalus doesn't want to be killed by the Minotaur in there, in this labyrinth that, after all, he built himself. So he says, I'm going to bring my inventor's talents to this problem, too. He creates wings for himself and his son, Icarus, out of beeswax and feathers and stuff, and they fly out of the labyrinth. And what does Daedalus say to his son, Icarus?
Don't fly too high.
Don't fly too low, because you will be eaten by the sharks or whatever.
Because the moisture of the sea.
The moisture of the sea will damage the rings. And then don't fly too high, exactly, William Gold, creating one of the great metaphors of all of literature. If you fly too close to the sun will melt your wings and you will fall to your death. And that's exactly, of course, what happens to Icarus. So,
what does that got to do with the Minoans, LP?
Well, the Minoans have labyrinthine architecture. If you go to look at Knossos and these palace type structures, they are full of twists and turns, and they look and feel like labyrinths. So it's very possible that the real labyrinthine structures of Minoa may have inspired this mythology about King Minos and all the people around him. By the way, you know who finally took out the Minotaur? It was Theseus, the hero of Athens, who also, I don't know if he went in on purpose to kill the Minotaur, if he got stuck in there, but he killed the hell out of that Minotaur.
Hell yeah.
So thank you, Theseus.
Now, I recall something else about the Minoans that may have been part of the inspiration for naming them, which was a tradition that we know of through their paintings, murals, I guess, of a sort of a bull leaping game, something similar maybe to what we would think of as like running from the bulls or something.
Yes, there's evidence from these paintings, specifically, that they apparently had these sporting type games involving bulls, but more generally that they just loved bulls there. Okay, this was a bull loving society. This is a society whose mascot, as it were, was the bull. So I think we can take away from this that, yes, King Minos didn't exist in all likelihood. Certainly, there's no real labyrinth. Even though there's these structures that look like little like mazes, there wasn't an actual maze there. But neither is it totally divorced from the mythology.
So here we have another case of but in this case, an ancient archaeologist finding some evidence and running with it.
The people who wrote the myths could be compared to archaeologists in a sense, because they said, look at these buildings. Because Minoa, by the way, as we discussed earlier, it was gone by 1300 BC.
Right.
And so most of the Greeks that we talk about when we talk about ancient Greece were living far after this. So yeah, in a way, they were almost like archaeologists. You're right. But the people who really discovered Minoa in our time came in the 20th century, and they drew the same conclusions too. That
there must be a Minotaur.
Not that there must be a Minotaur, but that there must be a connection to the myths of.
Look at all these paintings, and look at this maze.
And by the way, the paintings of Minoa are fantastic. They're just amazing. They are. We were talking about the Egyptian art last time, and of course, the Egyptian art is phenomenally interesting and great. But it strikes me how much more modern the Minoan art looks when I see it. To my eye, it looks almost like Fauvist painting, or some of that flat kind of art style that was popular in Paris after Matisse and so forth. It's really beautiful and remarkable. Speaking of religion and art, little is known about the specific religious beliefs in the Indus Valley, but archaeological finds include figurines, possibly of deities or symbols of fertility, or structures. They found structures resembling altars, but again, that may be that archaeological prejudice that when we don't know what a structure is for, we say it's a temple. And there are a lot of their art was sort of like decorative for pottery. We haven't really talked about pottery, have we, on this show? Because if you've ever been to a museum, one of the first things you might ask yourself is, what's with all the goddamn pottery? Right? I mean, to me, I don't know if it's just me, I'm not that interested in pottery.
Yeah.
So I don't go to a museum and go, oh, good. Every civilization here is mostly represented by pottery.
Yeah.
That's great. No, I'm disappointed by that. And so I asked myself, what's with all the damn pottery? And it turns out that there's an excellent reason why we have all this pottery.
Well, it's useful stuff, right? I mean, it's their everyday.
It's extremely useful.
Yeah.
It's not just useful, though, the way that pottery is useful to us. Pottery to us is a way to serve some food, right? I put a pot in front of you and you eat. Or I cook some food in the pot if I were a cook, But the potteries were used in granaries in ancient civilization. What is a granary, after all? We know that a granary is where you store the grain, right, for the future. But what does it actually look like? And the answer is it's full of these pots that are buried in the ground to keep them relatively dry and cool. And so their very survival depends on the integrity and excellence of these pots. And when you look at it that way, it makes sense that they would be so beautifully decorated. And we find this all around the world. We find this among the Inca in South America. We find it all over, that they put particular love and care into the art that they put on these pots. And there's yet another reason why the pottery is still around, and that is because ceramic is indestructible. Ceramic is more durable than almost any other material you find in the ancient world. It is more durable than most metals. Metals will rust and decay, and mud bricks will dissolve, and all this stuff. But stone and certain kinds of metal like gold and ceramics are the things that last.
I'm with you about the pots themselves a lot of times. But what's cool is, though, along with the pots, you all a lot of times get their ancient action figures that they build.
That's true. Action figures are cool.
Yeah, they're great.
Well, that's what we were just talking about. These figurines in Indus Valley Civilization of deities. I mean, what is that really but an action figure?
Of course.
And so in Minoan Civilization, on the contrast, what we see is evidence possibly of goddess worship. This is the elusive matriarchal society that was an extremely popular theory about 50, 60 years ago, 70, 80 years ago, that maybe a lot of early civilizations were matriarchal. Now there's less agreement on whether such societies actually existed. But Minoa is one of the places that reinforce that idea, because you see a lot of paintings of women who look like they could be priestesses. The priests are obviously a very important caste in any civilization. And so that's one of the sources of that. But again, as I said, the Minoan art is highly stylized, beautifully artistic, frescoes depicting nature and animals and daily life, which you don't always see in daily life and art, and a very colorful style.
Yeah, it looks like comic books almost.
Comic book panels.
Yeah.
Which again is like Matisse to me.
Oh, yeah.
Matisse, when you look at that Fauvist painting, it's like he will have a flat red background behind several figures, and the figures will be green.
Yeah.
But just a solid green, not like shaded and naturalistic, but very graphical. So yeah, that's an excellent way to describe it, though. It's a comic book art style. So while both civilizations may have had nature-focused deities and emphasized fertility, Minoan art is much more expressive, while Indus art tends towards functional and symbolic representations. So we can talk a little bit about the organization of their societies. We've already said there's people who look at Indus Valley and say there's a signs of a flat society with no hierarchy, but there's also evidence that there was strong collectivized control. And some of that evidence is just the fact that it's very difficult to build something like a sewage system with a bunch of unorganized individuals, right? I mean, have you ever seen the picture of course you have, but the picture of the man by Leonardo da Vinci, where he's standing in a circle with his arms and legs outstretched, showing that the top of his head, his outstretched arms, and his feet all fit within this circle perfectly. He called that picture the Vitruvian Man. He named Vitruvian after an ancient Roman architect called Vitruvius. And Vitruvius's great innovation, or one of them, was a standardization of things like pipes. So that if you could build pipes that would fit together, they would all have to have the same measurements so that they'd be you could have almost an assembly line style of engineering. And that's somewhat like what we see in Indus Valley. So people do take that, and I think reasonably, as a sign of central control. But on the other hand, some people say, where are the palaces? Where are the royal tombs? They haven't found any royal tombs. And so they say, well, in Minoa, we do have those. So that appears more stratified, but maybe not Indus Valley. I leave it to the listener to decide for him or herself whether such assumptions are warranted.
And decide for us, too.
And decide for us, please, because we cannot make up our goddamn minds.
I'd like to know, listener.
So I guess what you're probably wondering, William Gold, because this is a particular obsession of yours. How did these civilizations decline and collapse?
Hey, I want to know that too.
You do?
I do.
Well, I was going to whisper it to William Gold so that you couldn't hear.
No. Say it out loud.
I'm changing my whole approach. I'm going to tell everyone, including the audience, what I know or what I think. Around 1900 BC in the Indus Valley Civilization, the cities were abandoned. Okay?
Abandoned.
Abandoned. The people leave the cities. And the question is, why?
Where did they go?
Possibly, we don't know where they went. Okay, so just put that question right out of your mind, because you are going to torture yourself. You're not going to get a wink of sleep tonight.
Chat GPT, please tell me, where did they go?
Now, the cities were abandoned possibly due to climate change. For example, the river may have dried up, or that stretch of the river may have dried up. And boy, there is no reason to live there once the river's gone. It's also possible there were tectonic shifts, or it could be an unrelated to the ecology cause like economic decline. Now, for a long time, there has been a theory of the Indo-Aryans, or the Aryans for short. And let's face it, it's kind of confusing. These people are the Aryans, but they're not Hitler's Aryans, are they? Because Hitler's Aryans are, of course, white. But these Aryans are in India. They come down from the north, from like Nepal, what is now Nepal, and Bhutan or something, and they sweep through, and just, they're horsemen, so they are very effective militarily, and they just kick everyone's ass and take over. Right? That's this idea that's been around for centuries. Now people take it much more cautiously. They're not at all sure that this really happened. But for a long time, this was imagined as a cause for the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization. Now, in the Minoan Civilization, on the other hand, we have a decline around 1450 BCE, possibly due to the eruption of Thera, a volcano, or again, Poseidon himself with his earthquakes. Although it's also possible that there was a Mycenaean invasion. You remember the Mycenaeans? They're the ones who live around Sparta. They live on the Peloponnese. You know what the Peloponnese is? That's what we call mainland Greece. As you know, Greece is one mainland peninsula, but also a lot of islands. The mainland part is the Peloponnese. That's why the war between Sparta and Athens that is going to happen later on the Peloponnese is called the Peloponnesian War. So whether the Mycenaeans actually invaded or not, there was an assimilation into Mycenaean culture. They basically become part of the larger Greek society. A lot of mutual influence, but there's an end to the distinct Minoan civilization.
So it could have been gradual, is what you're saying.
It could have been gradual, and in both cases, both with the Indus Valley and the Minoans, it is mysterious.
Mysterious.
Because why?
We don't know.
We can't read their damn writing. We don't know what happened. They probably wrote, help us. The volcano Thera has just erupted, and the Mycenaeans are here with Achilles and Ajax and stuff, and they're killing us. Theseus just came and killed our Minotaur. But we can't read it, so we don't know. We don't know what they said. But it shows you an essential aspect of history. Again, how fundamental writing is to history. That it is a actual requirement of history.
Yeah.
That the best we can do when we have only archaeological evidence is engage in the kind of wild, woolly speculation.
But we can't blame them. They did right. We can't blame ourselves. We can't read
them. I'm not blaming them. They were not a pre-literate civilization like the prehistoric people were. They were a literate civilization. Now, the Mycenaeans during this time are going through a dark age, and they are non-literate. They are pre-literate. But it's actually interesting, though, because we think, well, what a terrible thing. All these illiterate Mycenaeans sitting there on mainland Greece. What pathetic, utter rubes they were, right? But out of such rough clay, diamonds can be plucked. And why do I say that? Because what was developed during the dark ages of Greece, the pre-literate period of Mycenae, the answer is
your favorite poem.
My favorite poems, the Odyssey and the Iliad. Yes. Those poems are largely considered to have required a non-literate population because their oral characteristics, the fact that they were composed orally and then passed down thousands of times over generations in an oral way, is in the deep structure of the poems themselves. The fact that, for example, all the characters have these memorable epithets that are repeated over and over and over. Achilles, the breaker of horses. Odysseus, the raider of cities. These are mnemonic devices that would have been totally unnecessary in a written poem.
Yeah.
But in a oral poem, they're essential. And it isn't just these epithets, they're just one example of many of the way that memory and performance influenced the nature of these poems. And they are considered by me to be the greatest poems ever composed, particularly the Iliad. And there I make my stand.
Okay, then.
Gentlemen, have you any other thoughts?
William, thoughts?
That incident with Minos's queen and the bull is kind of a strange story.
Yeah, it's a bit strange. She contrives to mate with a bull, and in a kind of modern way, right? Like you would think in a myth she would just go out and have sex with a bull. You know, after all, Zeus would become a swan or something, just go and have sex with a woman. There was no big elaborate ceremony involved. But in this myth, it's almost like someone might try to do it in real life. I'm going to actually get into this protective shell that will keep the bull from hurting me, and I'm going to trick the bull into coupling with me. And it's almost like how we extract semen from horses and bulls now. We use a machine, right? And so, lo and behold, the semen ushers forth freely and to our great bounty.
Yeah.
But what I love that comes out of this is the Icarus story.
Yes.
Flying the middle path.
Yes, fly the middle path. That's a typically Greek idea, isn't it? Everything in moderation, avoiding excess, or failing to do so at our terrible peril. We're in what will later be called the heroic age. Okay, they will call this the heroic age, and what do they mean by the heroic age? Well, they mean that the heroes lived then, but they literally believed in, like, Socrates' time, that people were bigger and stronger and much more capable and much more like gods during this very time period. They were looking back at their ancestors with great reverence. And even within the Iliad, you will hear Homer say this. And he says, nowadays, nobody could do this. But at this point, Achilles did thus and such. No one today, because men are worthless now, right? Men are weak and worthless. Yes. And well, it is a great reminder of the fact that there is no longer standing tradition in all of human culture, probably, than the idea that kids these days don't understand and they're basically a bunch of bums.
Yeah, right. And the things were so much better back in the old days.
Things were so great back in the golden age, and that's all over now.
Yeah.
And we all have to just lament the fact that it sucks now. Any questions for the kids at home?
Do you have any?
Do I have any questions for the kids at home? I don't know. I'm reluctant to ask if any of them has ever had sex with a bull.